Oh, good. We have a crowd. Have some folks. Hey, you got the peanut gallery. Is that the peanut gallery up there? Good. Well, like Lynn just said, we'll get going here in a couple of minutes. Thanks for being here. Won't be too long. We'll be streaming. We'll be online. And we are streaming now. Okay, very good. Hello, everybody watching on newsdakota.com. Be sure to bring your questions. Hopefully you brought questions. Be sure to have some, and we'll have a great discussion. It says 90 minutes. So if everybody asks one question that takes 5 minutes to answer, we'll fill up 90 minutes here. So in the meantime, good to see you, Larry. And it's exactly 10:30 to the second. So I think whoever is here is going to be here. If you have any stragglers, you folks are sure welcome to sit down if you'd like in the back. It's going to be a long time standing, so whenever you feel like sitting down, this is kind of like church, you know, a lot of seats up front are wide open. Nobody's going to preach hellfire and brimstone today, but we're going to have a great discussion on carbon. We're all made of carbon, and so we breathe carbon, and but there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of gray areas on the carbon sequestration, carbon capture. Farmers should be making money at it. Let's have a great discussion and hopefully answer some questions and get rid of some of the gray area. Our panel discussion this morning is brought to you by the Ag Committee of the Jamestown Chamber of Commerce, and our wonderful sponsor, Emily Bivens, is going to have a little word to say.
Thank you, Mick. I just wanted to say thank you for everybody for coming, and thank you to our panelists for coming and traveling all the way here. Our local Ag Energy Committee with the Jamestown Area Chamber works to promote our ag and energy industries and bring those relationships into our community. And we all know, all of you know how important agricultural is in our community and how it affects everything that we do within our community. But we're trying to promote that throughout the rest of our area. So a huge thank you to our Ag and Energy Committee for helping put all this together. And thank you, Mick, for moderating.
You bet. You know, the Ag and Energy Committee has done a few things in the past, like getting a crushing facility going and a few other things that Spirit would. So again, big tip of the hat to them. Our panel here this morning is comprised of Jason Laumb, Director of Advanced Energy Systems Initiatives with the EERC, Energy and Environmental Research Center, and Tom Oakland, Business Development and Research Manager, North Dakota Department of Commerce. Tom, you want to go first?
Sure can. As you said, my name's Tom Oakland. I've been with the Department of Commerce in the Economic Development Group for just over a year now. My history is in engineering and in the energy industry. Coming out of UND, I went to the Minot Air Force Base and did efficiency projects related to all of their energy consumption, whether it's renewables, natural gas, electricity from coal and such. And then from there, I've been a systems engineer at Coal Creek Station, working again with efficiencies, trying to make that plant more efficient with their dry fine system, which has been up and running now for about 12 years. So energy's been in my background, in my career, and along with that now working at Commerce, we blend it with agriculture tremendously. When you think of all the biofuels production, the interest in the state for sustainable aviation fuel as well, we have a lot of requests that directly impact the agriculture industry while also impacting our existing renewables and fossil fuel industry. So I grew up in North Dakota. I grew up on a farm in north central area in Towner County. So farming is near and dear to me and very important. So I'm very interested to answer any questions and discuss the concept of carbon capture, utilization, storage, and I'm guessing in this panel will be transportation of carbon is the big topic. So good to be here.
Thank you very much, Tom. Jason Laumb, Director of Advanced Energy Systems Initiatives. One heck of a title.
Well, don't be fooled by titles, right? You can only put those on paper. So my name is Jason Laumb. It's pronounced like Bauschand, but we're not related. I do have to work for a living still. I'm originally Western North Dakota native. Also grew up doing some farming and ranching, Tom. I like to tell my wife I've done every event that you could see on a rodeo, but never on purpose. So I can relate to a lot of the challenges that are facing the egg industry. I lived many of them for several years and was told, get the heck out of agriculture, you're going to go to school. So my background is in chemistry and in chemical engineering. I've been at the EERC for 22 years now. I've been working with the power sector that entire time, going back to my days as a graduate student in the late 90s. And I'm really excited about CO2 capture and storage opportunities in North Dakota. We are positioned in North Dakota to lead the world in this technology. This is cutting edge stuff that we're talking about. At the same time, it's not new, but it is cutting edge. What makes North Dakota the best place for this is, we have a really good, strong regulatory environment that allows us to do things somewhat independent of federal government and EPA oversight. We have ideal geology for CO2 storage. That is something that money can't buy, those rocks under the ground. We're very fortunate to have that. We also have the abundant energy resources in our state to support it. We have the coal mines and the power plants. We also have the oil industry that we can talk about a little bit later about how the oil industry can use more CO2 and store it underground and create more oil at the same time. We also have the local expertise to do it. We've been working on CO2 capture and storage at the University of North Dakota at the Energy and Environmental Research Center for the last 2 decades. So, okay, they turned our mics down on us, so. I'll wait for the sound man. So we've been working on CO2 capture and storage at UND and at the EERC for the last 2 decades. It's also an industry that's been around for several decades, and if folks have questions about that, we can certainly answer those. I'm excited to be here. I left Grand Forks this morning where it was sunny and 70 degrees, and it's a little bit blustery here, so happy to be here.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason. Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Grand Forks because EERC is a tremendous kind of another one of these great things that North Dakota has that flies under the radar. Last involvement I had was a hydrology class at UND in 1992. All right, so whether it's a carbon pipeline or a carbon capture program that Bayer or some of the other organizations, companies have to offer farmers, who regulates? Is the Department of Commerce, Energy, who is the regulatory arm and who decides who can do what? Is the pipeline different from a carbon capture program that farmers can monetize?
As far as the pipeline, it follows the standard pipeline regulations of the state with the Pipeline Authority, but also the national guidelines for pipelines as far as safety goes. There's specs on depth based on where you're at in the country with respect to whatever is traveling through that pipeline that the contractor has to meet, and all of those safety specs are followed. As far as the sequestration, our state is one of 2 in the country that has the Class 6 primacy. Therefore, we are able to regulate those permits for where and how much is sequestered. And I'll probably let Jason go on with that because he's got more background, but the state of North Dakota is one of 2 states that's able to regulate that internally versus having to go to the EPA.
Okay, what's the other state?
Wyoming.
And I believe Louisiana has also applied for that primacy. I don't know where that application is right now. but that the primacy applications are, they're vetted by the Industrial Commission. There's a lot of upfront work that needs to be done to get that permit to inject. Characterizing the rock that's underneath you, showing that the CO2 is going to stay where you put it, and awful lot of upfront geology work. I'm not a geologist, so I'm only going to talk at a very high level about this, but it is the Industrial Commission that vets those permits. Now, having primacy is a big deal. Why is it a big deal? If you lived in a state where you didn't have primacy, you would have to submit that application to the US EPA. Those applications right now are taking 1 to 2 years to get back from the federal government. In the state of North Dakota, about 6 to 9 months. Now that more of them are coming through, they are vetted and reviewed much faster, so that these folks that are investing in these projects and these technologies are able to hit the ground running and still be able to meet their deadlines that their investors want them to.
From a regulatory or an investor perspective, what's different between the Summit pipeline and a carbon capture program that a farmer can get paid for by doing carbon healthy things on his farm? Is it different? Does the government or an agency like EERC look at it differently?
So there really are two different things that you're talking about there. The Summit project is capturing CO2 from ethanol plants, okay? And that CO2 is transported and would be injected in North Dakota, and the surface owners own the pore space for CO2 in North Dakota, and those surface owners would be compensated for that CO2. You're talking about sustainable agricultural practices, like a terrestrial type of storage or biological type of storage. They are different. One of the challenges that there is out there, by changing farming practices to store carbon, is showing that you're storing it, showing that storage permanence. You need to be able to show that field that you've converted to grass now, say someone comes in 10 years and tills it up, well, there goes all your CO2, there goes a lot of the carbon that you've stored. So you need to show that storage permanence, and is one of those challenges that can be out there for some of those agricultural type of practices. But if you can show it, you can get the tax credits just like anybody else.
Tom?
I was also going to add that the big difference between the method of Summit's pipeline is the fact that you've got the Section 45Q and then the IRA, which enhanced it significantly. You're going up to $85 a ton, which is a direct pay from the federal government, and that direct pay makes a lot of these projects extremely viable, because these ethanol plants especially have nearly pure CO2 coming out the stack already. It's a matter of capturing, transporting, and from there, the investors in that system get that direct pay. And the benefit of that to us locally is the fact that those projects are now viable, which adds jobs to our local economy. It also lowers the carbon index of that fuel that's being produced at the ethanol plant. So all these ethanol plants end up with additional funding available, and it trickles all the way down to the source, which is where they're getting their fuel from the crops, from the corn. So ultimately that Section 45Q and IRA tax credit is funding the entire process to make it feasible.
Is that something farmers can take advantage of, or is it just the company?
Well, so when it comes to 45Q with something like an ethanol plant, I would certainly hope that a farmer could negotiate a better price for his corn if it's going to make a low carbon fuel. That's where one way I could see it trickle back to a farmer is getting a better price for that crop that you're selling under contract to an ethanol plant.
Seems like the best way to transport crude oil, natural gas, and carbon is a pipeline. The safest, whether it's a rail accident or a trucking accident, seems like pipelines are the best. But there's a lot of anti-pipeline ads that we see on TV and we hear on the radio, and those talk about how, hey, my husband farmer ran into a pipeline and it was a terrible thing, a big explosion. Is carbon transported in a pipeline, is it volatile? Is it dangerous to transport carbon via pipeline?
Well, carbon in a pipeline, carbon dioxide by itself is not dangerous. It's not volatile. However, it is under high pressure. And so that's where a lot of the concern comes up, is that if the pipeline were to rupture or get disrupted, you'd end up with a major pressure release. Now, these pipelines, similar to that of natural gas lines, are still have a standard where they have shut-off valves. They have safeties where sudden reductions in pressure will then isolate that section of the pipeline to limit the amount of CO2 that would be released. Just keep in mind that the high pressure of the gas is where I think a lot of the fear is. We have over 30,000 miles of existing natural gas pipelines that are pressurized across just the state of North Dakota. And a carbon dioxide pipeline is very similar to that.
Yeah, I would echo those sentiments that, pressure is the largest challenge. You just see, if you think about a CO2 fire extinguisher, that's what that pressure release looks like.
But if there's a volatility index, we're not going to have an explosion, just a
pressure release.
Okay.
So the CO2 in and of itself is very inert. It's a happy molecule that has two oxygens on it, so there's not going to be an energetic explosion there.
Okay, similar to if you bought it on IKEA, you'd get two tanks, one and then you'd have to put them together yourself there. Yeah, okay. Anybody have any questions so far? Yes, go ahead. Well, I'm going to come out and, without getting too much feedback here.
Just have one question about the safety element of it. Being a science teacher, I know carbon dioxide is heavier than air, and that if you have a large amount of carbon dioxide to a human or any animal, that would be a deadly poisonous gas in high concentration, because just in the physiology of it, when you exercise, you have to start breathing harder when you exercise because your body's building up with carbon dioxide. You have to get rid of it and take in that oxygen. So if you have a heavy amount of carbon dioxide right next to the ground that's released, not knowing exactly how it would work, but if you were in that area, you would be lacking oxygen. I just wonder if there's a safety element that has to be dealt with if there was a rupture of a gas line like that.
So as Tom had mentioned earlier, there are sensors on that pipeline to limit that volume that comes out during that release. And so those are the safety aspects that are installed on the pipeline itself. If the pipeline sees a massive, drop in pressure, that area is isolated and that volume is limited for the safety of those folks that may be in and around that. And the gas does diffuse when it gets into the environment, and the concentration does go down.
Okay, so we want to encourage people to ask questions here. Those of you who are watching online, if you have a question, put it in the chat column or a category down there, and we'll ask your question to our panelists here. Those of you who came here probably don't want to be put on the spot, but I'd like to get a little sense of who's here. And if you want to raise your hand, fine. If not, how many landowners do we have? I won't say farmers, but how many landowners do we have here who are concerned about? Okay, very good. Are you negatively or positively leaning towards an easement? Okay. Any concerns about giving up some of your land as to a pipeline company? No concerns? Everybody's real happy? Okay, good. Got a question here?
I'm not unhappy about anything necessarily, but we have some land that's not cropped, in North Dakota, which supposedly, probably, if it's native land especially, would have some value for carbon sequester. 50 years ago, Ducks Unlimited was thinking they struck a milestone with, kind of turning the tide of tilling land, and you talk about bringing land out of production, putting it back into grassland. So my desire, of course, would be, since I'm enjoy wildlife, enjoy something else on the land besides crops, would be to have value in none-tilled land. Now we know that in North Dakota cover crops are extremely difficult to get value out of. We just don't have enough growing season left here. So my desire, of course, is selfish, you know, from wanting, when we originated with ethanol, I didn't necessarily think it was a cost-efficient technique, you know, and that's kind of a mute question now. It's here. And so tillage of land and, you know, getting some value out of none-tilled land. Now we talk about eternity, which is totally a long time. So I'm interested in none-tilled land. That's why I'm here, and what this carbon credit possibly would have some value to in terms of people that don't want to till their land. You know, we have tons of, I was listening to the Grasslands Coalition person that said, when he came in, he said, I have 3 sons that want to go into farming, or go into out of the private sector, so to speak, and be on the land. So what the banker told him was, farm everything you can, end of discussion, because there's a safety network. Cattle suck. Cattle aren't valuable very much. You know, corn goes up, cattle go down, etc. So you know where I'm coming from. So that's my question.
Okay. The question is, how do you quantify the value of carbon on a grassland versus a cropland? Is that it?
Yeah, I'd like to see, okay, back into wildlife. You know, I don't work for the wildlife, but I grew up on land. We talk about whatever, you know, ducks around, things like that. We moved to Woodruff from Grassy Butte and Van Hook, North Dakota in the 50s. So you can imagine how many ducks were there. I was 7 years old when we moved, so I'm not that old yet, but my parents were born in 1908. But there were a lot of animals around. Now, this winter, for example, there's deer dying left and right, so big deal. Who cares about a deer? Pheasants are not in our area, big deal. Too cold, whatever. No, who gives a rip? Well, we some point in time, you know, we all have grandkids and great-grandkids, etc. So, yeah, I'm just interested in something besides cropland, therefore putting some value back in the non-cropped land, pastures, grass, weeds, whatever, and that's, you know, if you can, I'm sure you guys understand where I'm coming from.
Who wants to tackle that? Tom?
Sure. So the question I get here is that you're wondering about the possibility of carbon credits on untilled land, and if that's feasible with the existing system. Right now, the carbon credits are for captured carbon. So carbon emissions out of whether it's ethanol, fossil fuel plant, direct air capture is another system, but to my knowledge, what you're looking at is a natural capture through photosynthesis. That is not part of the Section 45Q tax credit. I can't speak to what the government's going to do in the future because who knows, it is possible. The one thing I will say though is that if that is feasible, that would then incentivize farmland to not produce food. So it'd be kind of a dangerous incentive to put forward if it becomes more lucrative to do nothing with your farmland versus producing food for society. So, but right now that's not part of the carbon credit.
Yeah, I think he said raising cattle on it and the protein from the cattle. That certainly would be a benefit. One of the challenges, you know, if indeed it does come to that, where some of these biologic storage systems are, you know, are allowed in the 45Q, is showing that the carbon's going to stay there. And that really is the hard thing, because one prairie fire and a lot of it comes out and could be detrimental to a lot of things, even though prairie fires do regenerate things. So.
Yeah, a lot of carbon in soot, in ashes. So, and that's unfortunate that it's not, the grassland component is not in the Section 45, because Lee Mansky out of the Dickinson Research Extension Center has proven that the most effective way of sequestering carbon is by cows clipping that grass and the photosynthesis of that grass regrowth. So, grasslands, wildlife lands, wildlife habitat lands, and wildlife restoration projects. But it's not politically not involved in the business plan just yet. So, any other questions from the audience or from online yet? So I've been on the. Okay, yes, Lynn. Just a second. You had a microphone down on the floor, but you left him. Okay, here you go.
So my question would be, when we're talking about the pipeline, like how deep would a normal CO2 pipeline be buried? And I'm assuming that if you do a North Dakota 1 call, you're going to locate those pipelines when, just like any other natural gas line, right?
Yep, that's correct. There is a spec for carbon dioxide pipelines in our area, and it's 3 feet at a minimum of distance from the surface. I have heard from Summit directly that they're speccing it at 4 feet for their project, but the actual spec by federal government is 3 feet.
Not as deep as a natural gas pipeline?
I believe it's the same spec as
Same
natural
spec,
gas.
okay.
It will be the same as our natural gas pipelines in North Dakota.
Okay. Answer your question?
They'd be marked then too, right?
They would be marked. So that'd be part of the 1 call. It's another utility essentially.
So I've been on the radio for 50 years. I've been doing the weather for about 40, and just almost 40 years being a meteorologist. But it's only been the last couple of years where climate is the enemy. And it seems like we're doing everything possible to control the climate, which is probably uncontrollable. But in the last few years, every company, every state, including North Dakota, has jumped on that we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030, going to be carbon neutral by 2050. That's wonderful. And North Dakota is the same thing. We're going to be carbon neutral. How does that benefit farmers by the state of North Dakota being carbon neutral? So I'm asking you to, as a member of the Commerce Department, to speak for the state, but
Okay.
we'll forgive you for
Sure.
anything you say.
Well, first off, that the goal of the state, as you stated, is 2030 carbon neutral. And it's a goal that the governor set forth across the entire state, across all industries. Jason and I were just discussing here recently, like roughly 50 to 60 million tons a year of CO2 is emitted on behalf of the state of North Dakota. By setting this goal, I can say this in the Economic Development Department of Commerce, we have had more calls and more interested parties from all over the world, internationally, from companies that want to come to our state and look for carbon neutral projects. Not necessarily something that we're using here, such as sustainable aviation fuels, but any sort of energy related projects, including fertilizer projects, which would benefit our farmers. The one thing I do want to kind of go off on a tangent on here is the fact when you say benefit farmers, to me, I look at that more like benefit our communities. Agriculture is the big industry in North Dakota, and I think farmers benefit if the general population benefits. It helps the quality of life for everybody here. And these carbon projects that are coming to the state are going to increase jobs, increase wages, and also take our existing energy infrastructure. That's a big part of it. If you look at energy, like it or not, energy is more of an impact on the taxes in the state of North Dakota than agriculture. That's just given the amount of oil, gas, and coal that we produce, and renewable energy as well. Some of those existing businesses have been threatened lately due to the climate change push, due to the carbon issues. And with this sequestration feasibility, if this happens in the state of North Dakota, which it's moving forward fairly quick, this makes those businesses sustainable going forward. And if those businesses thrive, we all thrive, including farmers. If you think about our ethanol plants since they came to the state, what has that done to the price of corn? And what has that done with the amount of acres going towards corn? And really, ethanol, it's another fuel. It's an energy source. But in a nutshell, I guess what I'm trying to say is every one of these industries affects each other. And if our communities are positively affected, I believe that positively affects farmers too.
The only issue that I have with all that is that the reason there is a lot of interest worldwide, and hey, we're going to go to North Dakota because we can do this, because they can make money. And there will be an unequal amount of money made by companies versus landowners in the state. And just like it's hard to quantify a grassland or a wildlife area versus a cropland or a pipeline, you know, how do you, do we have a formula yet on who's making money, and how is it fairly, the money in carbon sequestration, how is it fairly distributed? Jason, is there a EERC answer for that?
Do you want my John Q. Public answer? No.
Yeah.
So everyone's going to make a little bit of money. So the folks that come in and build these large projects, it's a huge investment. Okay, so to build a CO2 capture facility at one of our coal-fired generating units, you're talking about billions of dollars of investment. So they need to be able to get that investment back and make a little bit of money. So when we're talking, you know, gross dollars, those folks are going to get a little bit more gross than everybody else. But everybody else is also going to get some money.
But they're putting millions and billions on the table.
Billions of dollars. They're putting billions of dollars on the table to make this happen. And the return that's going to come to farmers, to our communities, like Tom had said, to everybody, is going to come in the form of lease payments. It's going to come in the form of tax revenue. Going to come possibly in the form of, if I were a farmer, I'd look for a low CO2 footprint fertilizer. I mean, how valuable would it be for me to produce crops where I can go back and say, hey, this anhydrous ammonia or this urea that I used, I can certify that the CO2 was captured when that product was made. I mean, I would try and market a crop like that, and that's one way that some very creative farmers could start to make some dollars. And there's technology out there that can do that right now. There are folks that are considering doing that. So. Yeah, so the manufacturer of that product would do it. You'd be simply buying a product from a manufacturer. Yeah. No, the farmer's not going to go out and create a CO2 capture system. I have one, and they're fun to run.
But Farmers Union, Farm Bureau, they're associate the North Dakota Ethanol Council and producers. They should have a public awareness campaign or a way for farmers to utilize that as a bargaining chip, as a negotiating chip, I think. Yes, go ahead.
I went to St. Louis 40-some years ago to learn how to make ethanol. And what's bothered me the whole time is the amount of CO2 that an ethanol plant puts off into the air. And so you figure, I'm trying to put the numbers out so the people will understand it. If you have a 100 million gallon plant, it's going to put out about 345 million ton a year is that right, or 345,000 tons a year in CO2 into the air.
So I'll give you a pretty good analog to think about. The Red Trail Energy, the ethanol plant, in Richardson. They're around 180,000 tons a year for the ethanol that they produce, and they're capturing and storing that right now.
How many gallon plant is that then?
I knew you were going to ask me that. I'll remember the ethanol gallons. I remember the CO2. That's the side of the
Okay.
plant I worked on.
And so that's what an ethanol plant is it is the low-hanging fruit. It's the the CO2 that's easiest to grab and sequester because we already have it there. And one thing for the people to understand is that crop that was brought into that ethanol plant, that corn, it sequestered all that CO2 out of the air in the previous 90 days from the time that seed was put into the ground and the plant grew and produced a corn crop. And it sequestered all that CO2 into that corn crop, and it was fermented, and now it's being released again. Just something to understand. In that ethanol plant, that is a really tiny part of what the whole thing of CO2 is. But tried to do the numbers on what you said, $85 a ton for the CO2, and is 30 cents a gallon of ethanol produced? Would that be a pretty close number?
I haven't converted it to an ethanol basis.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So, are we, the crowd that's here today, everybody in agreement? Carbon sequestration, carbon capture is good for the state of North Dakota and good for everybody here. I didn't think so. What's preventing you from getting on board the bandwagon of carbon? Yes, go ahead. Our science teacher again.
Besides the sequestration, what are some other uses that we could be putting into carbon right now or in the future that would be just as beneficial as putting it in the ground? I mean, there are other technologies out there coming. I may speak for our water plant person right here. We have an issue with food grade carbon dioxide right now, shortage of it, big time in the state of North Dakota and probably even nationwide. We don't have enough carbon dioxide for our own use, for our city, for our water treatment plants and other places like that. So if we have this very nice pure carbon dioxide coming from these ethanol plants, and we need carbon dioxide to run our water treatment plants, other uses for carbon dioxide that we need. Any offerings for what that can do?
So you do bring up a good point there. One of the challenges is, okay, if you're trying to show CO2 storage and you create a food grade CO2, that CO2 is then released when it's utilized. Ethanol plants, absolutely, you can create a food grade CO2 and they can help fill some of that market. They won't get the 45Q or CO2 storage credit for that because when you open that can of soda and you open that can of beer, it comes right back out. So there are some other uses. There are other uses like there are folks that make an aggregate or soil stabilizers out of CO2. But to get the 45Q credit for it, which is what really makes things drive, you have to show that that CO2 is there nearly forever.
One other major use would be the enhanced oil recovery. And with enhanced oil recovery, there's now evidence showing that you can pump in more carbon dioxide in the cavity the oil came out of than that same amount of oil will emit through its life. Therefore, they call it a carbon negative barrel of oil. So that's one major use. But kind of going back to the discussion about incentives from the government, like through these tax incentives, by putting $85 a ton out there for sequestration, you've just now made that $85 compete with food grade CO2. Another one I've heard is greenhouses, commercial greenhouses need CO2. They want to see 800 plus parts per million for their yields. It's common, it's across the world, they all do it. Well, now if you set up a greenhouse next to an ethanol plant, the owner of that ethanol plant's going to say, well, it's at least $85 a ton because that's what I'm getting otherwise by pumping it underground. $60 is the price for enhanced oil recovery. To me, it's a little unfortunate they didn't match those numbers just because of the fact that at least you're getting something out of the enhanced oil recovery other than the sequestration. But right now, as we said earlier, it's up to the federal government and the incentives they put out.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned greenhouses. I'm a big fan of the potential for greenhouses in North Dakota, another form of agriculture. I want my fresh North Dakota grown strawberries in February, doggone it. I want those. I mean, there's business opportunities there for produce to be grown in greenhouses that can take CO2 from some of these ethanol plants. And I know both Tom and I have looked at that.
Yeah, and then one other one that has come up recently, I've heard it from multiple companies across the country, is using CO2 for concrete production. It's like it'll displace the cement need while maintaining its same structural integrity. So cement, as of right now, is a very carbon intensive process to make that cement and truck it across the country. Well, you can replace a portion of it, at least, with carbon dioxide. But again, that new technology now, I believe that's certified, proved as a sequestration method, but everything has to compete for these tax credits too.
Just like farmers, you mentioned $85 for the food grade CO2. Hey, can you give me more than that? It's like buying land or renting land from the neighbor, isn't it? Whatever the market is, can you give me a little more? So, yes, I'll come back and hand you the microphone.
Is there other components to the 45Q? I mean, you mentioned sequestration for the $60 a ton for other uses of that carbon. I think the idea behind having that reduced value is you're also making a profit on that ton of CO2. So if I sell a ton for $60, it now becomes, with that tax credit, $120 ton. Isn't that kind of the idea behind the other components of the 45Q?
You're exactly right, and that's why they discounted the CO2 used in enhanced oil recovery. As the thought is that the CO2 capture facility is going to get some amount of money from an oil field operator. That's always been a little bit of a challenging thing, is oil field operators will go, well, we'll take your waste, and the utilities go, well, no, pay us for it. So that's been one of the gaps that's been there. There are EOR projects that are going on in the U.S. right now, and that delta right there, we can all do that math. And is that the going rate? Well, I'd say it's not that far off.
Also, just going back to that though, with greenhouses, that's not considered one of them, because that's that natural biological absorption of CO2, which I would just say is kind of unfortunate, because now the price for that greenhouse CO2 would be $85, minus of course the fact that you can't simply capture. That's one thing we should specify. Capturing off an ethanol plant, though it comes out pure, is energy intensive. You have to compress it to move it, and therefore costs go into it right off the get-go before you are able to transport that CO2.
So unlike farming, which has been around for millennia, food production, carbon capture, carbon sequestration, this is kind of a new business. There's a lot of fuzzy math or unique formulas that are still a work in progress, would you say?
Compared to agriculture, it's new. Compared to some other businesses, no, it's not new. It's been around for decades. It's been utilized in Texas. It's been utilized here in North Dakota. Dakota Gasification Company's been capturing CO2 and sending it to the Weyburn Midale oil fields for 20 years. They've been doing it longer in Texas. It's a scale-up challenge that we're seeing right now. So the scale of these projects that we're talking about are quite large compared to what they've been in the past. Let me give you a few examples. The two of the power stations in North Dakota that are looking at putting CO2 capture on, it's no secret, the Cold Creek Station and Milton R. Young Station. Each one of those, if they were built today, would become the world's largest CO2, post-combustion CO2 capture facility. The world's largest. So we're talking about a challenge of scale right now with a lot of these things. There are technology improvements that can be made and efficiency improvements that can be made, which is one of the reasons why the federal government put 45Q out there to get things going.
from the commerce perspective, I'd say it's fairly new in the way that this credit came out. With the new credit and with the fact that the state has this 2030 neutrality goal, the interest to our state is tremendous. We get calls every week from a new company that has a new technology, many of which have not yet been vetted. It's just a matter of new ideas that are coming out. So I would say that despite the fact that, like, using Dakota Gasification Company as a good example, they've started, I believe it was in 2000, they started capturing their carbon dioxide, sending it into Canada for enhanced oil recovery. So obviously it's been around for quite a while. I think last I looked they were at 41 million tons that they have captured and transported. So it's been there, but with this new incentive, it's creating a lot of new interest and new technology advances. So I will say it's an evolving process right now.
Like you mentioned, companies worldwide are interested in what's going on in North Dakota, what the potential is in North Dakota. But for the benefit of everybody sitting here in the chair, I don't have a few billion, and I don't think anybody else here, maybe somebody here has a couple of billion they want to start a project and make some money. But how do we get the water treatment facility to be able to get the food grade carbon dioxide to make things happen? How do we get the landowners to make money? How do we get the ball rolling for these projects, which the people with billions, yeah, they need to get their billion or so back and then start making money. How do we get landowners in North Dakota or people up and down the residential neighborhoods in towns like Jamestown, Valley City, Edgeley? How do they make money too?
I think the very first step is what Tom and I are doing today, getting out in the public, answering questions, addressing concerns that people have, and hopefully alleviating them to the point where people are comfortable with this technology, and then get that first large project rolling, and people can start to see the benefits of that and start to see those dollars coming in, start to see those jobs coming, start to see that, potentially that CO2 created for their water treatment plant. I think, that's kind of how we need to roll here. Tom, anything you want to add?
I would also say, like you said, education is a major part of it. Just to talk about it, to have these sessions or Q&A, learn what the latest new ideas or where the next project's going to hit. I will say I've had 3 different projects recently, all interested in fertilizer production in the state of North Dakota. And fertilizer is a very important part of our economy. There's no question about it, and we've all seen what the prices have done recently. We have companies interested in coming to the state that would like to look at building a fertilizer plant. However, capital investment is always the biggest hurdle to hit. So I can't speak for individual companies necessarily, but there will be funding requests, whether it's publicly traded, whether it's cooperatives that may look for funding opportunities. I think that investing in our state is critical. And one other side note to that is the fact that we are producing so much energy in western North Dakota, so much oil and gas, and those numbers are continuing to go up just due to the fact that there's more gas as those wells age. And so we need to come up with ways to utilize our energy here. Fertilizer is a big one. That's one thing I could think of is that if you learn about a project coming around, I would definitely take interest in it and ask questions.
A lot of commodity organizations, corn growers to be specific, have had value-added projects that they call, and they get their members to invest in corn, fertilizer plants or other value-added projects. And so maybe we need to get more, like you said, local investment so they can get local money back.
So there's a lot of money that wants to come into the state for the carbon capture, right? Is the state getting in the way between those dollars reaching the farm? Like, so we can do carbon sequestering from the ethanol and make it go away, right? Or you mentioned terrestrial, or kind of like what the farmers are actually doing, changing farming practices, that kind of thing. So I don't know, can you explain the scale of, like, when a farmer changes his farming practices, cover crops, those kinds of things, is that a drop in the bucket compared to the capture we're doing through ethanol plants, or is it the other way around? And so, because like, can we get some of those dollars coming from other countries directly into the hands of our communities? Is there a way to do that?
You had a question?
Okay, I might need something harder than coffee for this question. It's a good question, and I'll answer. There's parts of it that I can answer and parts of it that I just don't know yet. Okay, when you talk about scale, you talk about terrestrial sequestration. You know, there was a report that was recently put out that said, you know, a third of our CO2 capture goal can be accomplished by biologic or terrestrial sequestration. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that's a little off base. So when you're looking at the comparison between the terrestrial, the biologic, and what's coming off an ethanol plant, it's going to be more efficient, more effective to capture that CO2 off the ethanol plant. Same time, like our friend in the back there, I like wildlife. I care about deer. I mean, I'm a landowner. I have some acreage, and I enhance that for wildlife. I don't go and till it all up and try and produce something out of marginal land that I have. I also understand that everyone needs to eat. So when you compare the two, capture off an ethanol plant or off a large power station is much larger than what you're going to be able to get out of the terrestrial part of it. Is there any other aspect you wanted to address, Tom?
Well, as far as that ratio, I would go as far as saying yes, it's a very small amount in comparison to a ethanol plant or especially a fossil fuel plant, because you're talking millions of tons a year. Like we mentioned, the two plants that are looking at it right now are roughly 15 to 20 million tons a year. So when you start looking at per acre of land and what your farming practice, whether you're switch to no-till or whatever it may be, there's a lowered carbon intensity, but it is a lot smaller. What I would say, though, is as far as this interest from other countries or other states that want to come invest here, they're wanting to invest here because of our natural geologies is a big one, and because we are a major exporter. And we export far more energy than what we use here locally. We also export far more food than we would use locally. Obviously, we're a significant agriculture producer. Going forward, there is all kinds of society-driven trends that make products more expensive or more sought after if there's a lower carbon footprint from the very beginning. Now, I can't quantify that or say exactly what that is, but you go to the grocery store right now, you'll see there's an organic section and then there's a traditional section. Well, eventually, who knows? There could be a low CI score on wheat. I have no idea, but that's the trend everything's going towards, like it or not. But I could see that becoming a benefit to the farmers here. If you look at our ethanol is a perfect example. Our ethanol that we produce, especially now that we can start sequestering all that carbon dioxide, will have the lowest CI score in the country. What that means is that most of it will get exported because there are other states that are willing to pay a premium for that. California, the whole West Coast, they want to take that ethanol because it's a low CI score and they'll pay a premium. That premium is trickling down to whoever's supplying the feedstock. So that's where I could see the big benefit.
How many of you in the audience are familiar with the whole CI score and the carbon intensity formula? Okay, that is the big rage on the East Coast and the West Coast. And that's why most everybody on the East Coast, especially in New York, New England, they don't burn wood. They don't have natural gas. It's all heating oil, all fuel oil. And to get biofuel oil is a big deal for them because it lowers their carbon intensity score. Everything in California, Washington, Oregon, it's all CI score, and that's really going to be part of the future. Is everything has a score. But that's where the fuzzy math comes in again. Doggone this fuzzy math. You know, an ethanol plant, it's a closed system. They make the ethanol, they make the carbon dioxide's created, it's in the system, it's in the pipeline. This pipeline stays in the pipeline until it gets injected into the ground way out west. And farming, it's all over. And so, how do you solve that equation?
So, one of my statistics professors told me a long time ago, and he was right. Figures don't lie, but liars can figure, right? Okay. It all depends on where you draw that box, and you have to draw that box around your entire system appropriately. To determine the carbon intensity of something, we do something called a life cycle assessment. For example, we've recently done some life cycle assessments for some of our ethanol plants, and what is the carbon intensity of that ethanol that's produced, or that CO2 that you store. We go all the way back to the farm practices. We go all the way back to the field. Okay, there's a CI out there for tillage. There's a CI out there that says, okay, if you leave this much of the crop residue, you know, out in the field in western North Dakota, you're going to leave a little bit more residue because it's dry. And the Red River Valley, you're going to want to get it all off and grind it out. Okay, so there are different carbon intensity scores for even different parts of the ag sector throughout the U.S., and you have to choose the right one to do that. So when we do these assessments, we go all the way back to the farm, how that crop was produced, the fertilizer usage that was produced. Was that fertilizer a low CI fertilizer? Right now, I don't know that you can even buy one. So that's how that math is done, and a reputable organization needs to be doing that math, because if you're counting on the person that's selling you the product to do it, they're going to make it look better than probably I would. You know.
I would actually compare renewable energy credits in a way. Like, we've all heard of companies will sign up and they'll say they're running off of carbon-free energy sources, but yet you go on the grid, there's no green electrons or black electrons. It's all meshed together. And if you want 24/7 power, can you guarantee it's coming from a carbon-free generator? You really can't. Going forward, though, this CI score, that's becoming a spotlight. They're looking at it a lot closer, to the point where there could be benefits to farming practices changed, or what type of fuel goes in your equipment, because that lowers your actual carbon intensity of that product. And those are the benefits that I could see trickling all the way down to the landowner and operator.
Yeah, and everything has a carbon intensity. Even, you know, some of the renewables, they have a carbon intensity. That wind turbine had to be manufactured out of something. Okay, those solar panels had to be manufactured out of something. So while it may be a lower carbon intensity than, you know, fossil fuel that's not capturing CO2, it's not free.
So it just kind of, as we move forward, CI score, that's something to keep in mind, because it will affect farming and agriculture. So yeah, we started with organic at the grocery store. And then about 10 years ago, the buzzword was sustainability. And now we've got a whole bunch of different ways of calculating how do we make the earth better to live on? How do we make the earth still here and for our great-grandchildren, or in the 23rd century, how do we make the world a better place to live? But it still comes back to, I think a lot of you are here because of, I don't know what carbon capture is all about. I don't know what carbon credits are all about. I don't know how this will help make me money on the farm. Is that how many of you are kind of a little more knowledgeable? You feel glad you came? How many are still kind of really in a gray area? You all got real smart in the last hour. Good. All right. Any questions from online, or any other questions from the audience? Got one always in the back. Okay, I need the exercise.
So this isn't really a question, it's more of a statement, or really kind of put off what you guys have said. As somebody who's worked in the ag industry for a little over 10 years, working directly with producers in North Dakota and also being a producer myself, people really need, I think there's a lot of hesitance around people in agriculture and farmers and ranchers is because this is really, you know, not really understanding all of it, and education is the right part. But I think what producers need to think about as going forward, that as you look at these commitments in the supply chain, it's not only going to impact producers on the front end as companies are trying to reduce their footprint, but it's also going to direct or impact producers on the back end when you're selling your product, like you're talking about getting that additional premium for selling something because you can reduce your footprint. So I think that's really something important that producers need to look at on this, is how is it impacting me from the front end and the back end of the supply chain, but then also realize that agriculture and forestry are really looked after from these companies to reduce carbon footprints, because ag has the ability not to only reduce, but we can also add carbon back to the soil with cover crops, planting trees, grasslands. So I think that's really why agriculture is kind of a new input on this, is because we have the ability to not only reduce carbon, but we can also add back to reducing that CO2.
Yes?
I
No?
completely agree.
Yeah.
I think that the spotlight right now is not on that source so much, but in the future, it very likely could be. And with that being said, it's worth educating yourselves and having these discussions of what's to come, what's going forward. And keep in mind that I think one summary I would say, like, of this whole discussion, whether you agree with it or not, whether you agree with the carbon capture need, the necessity, as far as it's in principle, the facts are a significant portion of our population across the world wants to see a lowered carbon intensity. And we supply them with a significant amount of their energy and food. Therefore, if you're able to make additional premium by having that lower CI score, or if we're able as a state to absorb some of these federal tax credits that are put out there because we just happen to be lucky enough to have the pore space below us, I don't see it hurting our economy. I don't see it hurting our population. I see this being a very good benefit for us going forward and helping us.
I agree.
All right, so as we move forward then, where is the accountability for who is accountable for coming up with how much money farmers should make? Because yeah, that's a great point. Agriculture's unlike somebody who has a job working for the government or a university or working for the city or working in a factory. Farmers have a lot more capability of lowering the world CI score. How do farmers benefit from that? How do landowners make sure they get their fair share? Jason.
First off, I'd say come in with an open mind with some of these projects that are coming in. Ask questions like you're doing today. Educate yourself and look for those areas where you can benefit your farm. Whether it's marketing a product, whether it's leasing land for CO2 storage. There are several areas that I can see right now that can certainly benefit landowners. Maybe it's producing cattle with a lower carbon intensity. You know, folks will buy darn near anything with a lower CI score right now, and you all feed the world, so there's a lot of opportunity there as these markets continue to grow. It's not going to happen overnight, but I just keep an open mind, ask questions. You know, I'm not going anywhere. I'm easy to find.
I would also go as far as saying, though, that this is going to happen naturally because farmers across the country are willing to change according to whatever keeps their operations sustainable. And going forward, you're going to sell your product to whoever's willing to pay you the most. And if that means it's to an entity that, if it's a low CI score, or maybe it's to the local ethanol plant that's benefiting from these tax credits because they can afford to pay you the most, it's going to happen automatically. Like, to some extent, it's follow the market. And the direction the market's going right now is they're asking for everybody to lower their carbon intensity. Whether that has any direct impact on you locally, it does have a direct impact on the supply chain and the pricing and demand. So I think it happens to somewhat, it just happens naturally.
Yeah, and in the last 12 to 18 months, every company from A to Z has come up with a carbon program for farmers. How many of the farmers that are here have been approached by a company? Hey, sign up for our program. A lot of companies are saying, sign up for our program. And you're not really sure if it's a good idea or not, because you're talking to a salesman who says this is the best thing since sliced bread. But going forward, again, how do we quantify? How do we make it fair?
There are other companies too, just keep this in mind, that the term carbon credits right now is mostly related to the tax credit. You get a direct payment from the government. But there's also a secondary market of carbon credits for sequestration with large companies that want to invest in whoever's got the new technology to store carbon. Direct air carbon capture is one that's somewhat taking off a little bit, but there's others out there. I've been approached even at the state with directly related to ag, but projects that want to come in and find ways to capture the carbon, store it indefinitely, and their market's not relying on that tax credit. They're relying on larger corporations that are willing to pay a carbon credit fee because that helps them with their overall CI score.
Like the ethanol blender credit that major companies will buy from another company so they don't have to blend the ethanol.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or if they're in an area, like right now, we've had a lot of interest from Japan. Japanese companies come here to the state of North Dakota, and there's one common theme. They look at what we have, like with respect to, like, you take our population density compared to what they have, then you take our resources compared to what they have. And then you take now this new resource that technically is a vacant space of pore space. That's a huge resource right now. And those are all things that happen naturally. We just assume it's always been there. To other countries, this is like the biggest benefit. We have such an advantage to where they're willing to invest here because they want to lower their overall carbon intensity by increasing our efficiencies overseas, essentially.
Sure. Which is totally different than the Energy Star rating that's on the refrigerator that we buy, right? Totally different. The carbon intensity score or the Energy Star rating. Still saving energy, I guess, good, better for the planet, but there is a lot of marketing involved in all the carbon programs out there, both locally, commercially, and maybe some from the government too. There's a lot of marketing, would you say?
Oh yeah. Yeah. There's definitely a lot of marketing that goes on into it. We are, as a state, we compete with our neighboring states and with other areas in the world as well. Like, there's an interest in large operations that come here for site selection, and we know right off the get-go that we're just one of 5 states they're looking at. So we have a major marketing campaign, and this carbon capture ability is what gives us the edge over all the others.
Yeah, but you mentioned, we're exporting a lot more than we produce, but unlike Texas, our power grid doesn't go down in February in a blizzard, though, right? We don't have to burn furniture to stay warm. We're doing pretty good.
We don't want to talk about the power grid, do we?
Well, what we will say is that we need to pay attention to our power grid. Maybe that hasn't happened to us, but that doesn't mean it couldn't. We need to make sure we keep our reliable baseload electricity running.
I would agree. To think that MISO couldn't go down, I think, would be a foolish thought. So as more and more baseload power gets removed from our grid, which is happening right now, our resources become more and more constrained. I think about if the Coal Creek Station, you think about when Coal Creek Station was announced for sale, or they were going to shut it down. Anyone remember when that date was that they're going to shut it down by? It was July of 2022. Think about where Minneapolis, St. Paul would have been with this cold snap they had without the Coal Creek Station pumping 1,200 megawatts down there. I think there would have been some furniture that went up in smoke. That's just me thinking Joe Q public here. But our power grids still need a little bit of work. We need more of that sustainable baseload power out there, which is one of the things that CO2 capture and storage does. It allows us to keep these large power generators, keep our lights on, keep us warm. We're able to maintain the quality of life that we want. And let me tell you, everyone likes fossil fuel when they find out it's their only way to charge their iPhone.
Yep. Good point.
Well, the week before Christmas, I'm sure most every one of us got a letter or an email from your utility company letting you know that all generators that can run are currently running, basically suggesting shave load if you can. And that's with all of our existing carbon emitting plants running. There's still a very large population working hard to shut those plants down. Carbon capture and sequestration is what negates that argument.
It's funny you bring that up. Not only the letter, but over in Grand Forks, we're right on the Minnesota border. And so I got one of those emergency notifications on my phone over Christmas that said conserve natural gas. Why? Because it was cold and everybody was using natural gas. So we're still kind of right there on that edge from time to time when there's those max gen events.
And people that butcher some of their own beef or gather chicken eggs every day out on the farm are in the catbird seat when it comes to the cost of living. So farmers are great. Farmers do a lot of good for the world, and farmers are in a pretty good position and should be able to be in a good position to make some money. Any other questions from the audience? Yes. Got some good question askers here.
My question's regarding, you had mentioned air capture. Are there any facilities in North Dakota looking at that process?
Yes, there will be.
I'm assuming it's probably the coal-fired. That's usually the more lucrative ones to do that?
No, not necessarily. There are entities that are looking at putting direct air capture in our state. There have been announcements made by the DOE that they'd like to see some direct air capture hubs. So
Sure.
I know that there are entities looking at putting direct air capture in our state.
Next question. I know CO2 is slightly acidic. Is there a way you neutralize that before injecting, or?
So CO2 is acidic when you combine it with water and creates carbonic acid. So CO2 in and of itself, just floating around in the air, is not.
So how do they capture the CO2?
Oh boy, we need those strong drinks again, Tom. So let's go with an ethanol plant, because that's a more general case. So the CO2 that comes off those fermenters is nearly pure. There's CO2, there's water vapor, and there may be some small amounts of some organic molecules, maybe a small amount of oxygen, nitrogen, because everything leaks a little bit. That CO2 is dehydrated and then compressed, and that's one of the things that they do. They keep that water out of there so you don't form that acid.
Okay. Next question would be regarding, I'm sure the next push will be for pipelines. Installation of pipelines. Who is responsible for installing the pipelines and financing those?
So the pipelines that well, the big one right now is the Summit Pipeline. That's coming across the state, and they're working with all the landowners. That is fully privately funded. That is a separate company looking at, it's essentially like it's a transportation of a utility, similar to a gas pipeline company. So they're working with, we'll call them suppliers of carbon dioxide, which are all ethanol plants. So along their path, any entity that has excess CO2 that they want sequestered, they can condense it all into one pipeline and go to western North Dakota. And they're working with landowners for the pore space where they're not owning it, they're leasing that land. Those surface owners are getting paid based on the tons that are stored below them. So that's all, it's a business essentially, but the top of the supply for funding is coming from that tax credit in the end. They're able to justify that cost. I believe it's $1 billion in the state of North Dakota's pipeline alone, through the fact that you have between 10 and 20 million tons a year that would be sequestered in western North Dakota. So you do the math on that, that's a significant amount of funding that they're able to collect from those tax credits.
Yeah, and in short, who builds and pays for the pipeline depends on the business case. It really does.
Okay, any other questions from the audience, or if we have any online from folks who are watching online? All right. Well, how many of you, once again, I'll ask the same question I asked earlier. How many are glad you came and feel a lot more knowledgeable now, feel somewhat comfortable with what's going on in the carbon intensity world, the carbon capture world? I don't know, it's not the green agenda, but it is trying to make the world a better place to live. Storing carbon, North Dakota is uniquely qualified, capable, and should be able to make some money. And North Dakota, what is it, 97% of the land in North Dakota is privately owned by farmers, ranchers, and farmers and ranchers should be making their fair share of money in the carbon business. So that's something very important. So now, anyway, go forward, and as you work with the people who are approaching you for a carbon program, or if you're working for the water plant, or if you're concerned about the grasslands or wildlife, now you feel a little bit more knowledgeable. Thanks to our good folks here, Jason Laumb and Tom Oakland. Give them a nice big round of applause. Thank you, guys. Give you an opportunity to